Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiator. So this is a video I've been planning to do for quite a long time, but I went round and round in circles on it and got distracted. What do I consider the 5 most annoying, we could say worst, but obviously that's subjective. What do I consider, to me, the 5 most annoying weapons in the original Lord of the Rings trilogy? So the first thing to say is, I actually really like the original Lord of the Rings trilogy. The subsequent films, not so much, but by and large, the weapons, if not so much the armour, but the weapons in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, by and large, are really good. And that's because they were made by some excellent people in New Zealand, and they knew what they were doing, and a lot of the kind of lead characters' weapons, be they swords or axes or spears or whatever, are really good. So this isn't a general criticism. However, there are 5 things which subjectively annoy me about the weapons in Lord of the Rings. So let's start up with number 5. So at number 5, and this is, you know, only hedges into this list. It's not a major annoyance for me, but it actually annoyed me at the first viewing of the second movie in the trilogy, more actually than it does now, I have to say, but nevertheless I've included it, and it is Uruk-hai pikes. So first of all, I quite like the fact that the Uruk-hai are given pikes. It's a neutralising factor to the cavalry, either the Riders of Rohan or perhaps Gondor cavalry that they expected to face. But bear in mind that they are going to Helm's Deep, and given that it's a siege, pike blocks aren't terribly useful in sieges throughout history. Admittedly, this is fantasy, but what were they expecting to use the pikes for? Well, presumably to protect from the Riders of Rohan, which in the end, the pikes didn't really work against the cavalry charge downhill with the sun in their faces, as we know from watching the movie. But what annoys me about these pikes is the design of the heads of them. So when you have a weapon that's very long, you want it to have a relatively small and light head. That is why pike heads tend to be small and pointy. These are fairly large, choppy looking and hooked appendages on the end of their pike poles. And you might go, but Uruk-hai are really strong, so they can carry really large heads on the end of their pikes. Whilst that may be true, wood is wood. And I'm afraid that if you have a very long pole of the diameter shown and you stick something heavy on the end of it, it will flop. So one of the main reasons why you don't stick a heavy end on the end of a pike, or a large end on the end of a pike, is because the pike will bend, and in bending, any impact it receives will bend the pike further and snap it. It will be a very ineffective thrusting weapon, at least when it's as long as a pike shaft. In the case of this, also, why are the hooks there? You know, hooks on other pole arms like bills and falchards and various types of guisarme and things like this are there in order to hook, like spike through armour, perhaps pull people off horses, this kind of thing. On this type of very long pike, it doesn't make an awful lot of sense. And the blade of the weapon, whilst it looks like it's almost a cutting blade, almost like a glaive, is off-centre from the centre line of the pike. So basically, to cut a long story short, I think that this design of polearm head on a very long pike makes absolutely no sense, even if they do look quite cool. So in at number 4, I realise that this is a weapon which has actually been covered by various other videos on similar topic, similar videos to this, and that is the Witch King's Flail, Witch King of Angmar, I believe he's called. The Witch King's Flail. There are lots of problems with the design of this, and this was Return of the King, of course, this was shown in. Lots of problems with the design of this flail. Essentially, the head is too massive. It is too huge. Yes, okay, he's inhumanly strong, but it's just comically large, and I actually think makes the weapon look, instead of more imposing and more scary, it actually makes it look more ridiculous. In addition to the incredibly large size of the head, it's also, which is kind of, it has to be said, in a sort of flanged mace design, which is unusual to see on the end of a chain. But the basic problem is that the chain is ridiculously large. along, if we look at historical flails, we'll see that usually, not always, but usually they are two levers joined together, and the joining, the flexible part joining those two things is usually a lot shorter than this. But nevertheless, this is fantasy. He is an undead king riding a Nazgul, so who am I to criticize? Maybe this is a specialized weapon, but nevertheless, I think it looks a bit silly, and they could have made something maybe with a spiked head, maybe a bit smaller spiked head, maybe 2 heads or 3 heads on the end, which actually would have been more historical as well, rather than one massive football-sized lump of iron. I think it could have looked a lot better. So that's number 4, the one that annoys me. In at number 3 are the Easterling polearms, specifically these halberd-like things. Now, I should point out, I'm not at all bothered by the shorter ones that are like poleaxes and are carried by themselves. The reason these long halberd ones annoy me so much is actually not because there's anything specifically wrong with the halberd's design, but it's because they're carried with shields. And anybody who studies history will know that unless you have some very specific thing in mind, you don't equip someone with both a halberd and a shield, because you can't use the two things together. So yes, you can hold a shield, but what are you going to do with your halberd? It has a very large steel or iron head, which is very heavy. You cannot use it one-handed. You can't chop with it one-handed. You can't even use it for poking one-handed because the head is too heavy and you can't support the weight in one hand. These are humans, they are Easterlings after all. So therefore the halberd is an incredibly poor choice of polearm to give people with shields. So either ditch the shields and leave them with halberds, or let them keep the shields and give them spears or pikes or some more sensible and lighter headed polearm instead, which they can actually use with their shields at the same time. In at number 2 is a weapon which is actually perfectly historical, and I have no problem with the weapon itself, and that is the shields of the Rohirrim, or the Riders of Rohan. Now the shields themselves are modelled on Anglo-Saxon, Frankish, Viking era shields, boss-gripped shields. Nothing wrong with the shields at all per se. It's the fact that they don't use them. And this is one of the things in all of the original trilogy movies, one of the things that annoys me the most about the weapons and the way they're represented in the trilogy. And that is that the Rohirrim are very often shown with these shields attached to their horses, hanging from the saddles, it seems to be. Now, if you've got these shields, and bear in mind they are being shot at by archers, they are opposing pikes, why on earth would you have your shield, which is very, very useful, in your left hand? You can hold it at the same time as holding the horse's reins in your fist, and this is what was done historically. Why not hold the shield in front of you? At the very least, there is some historical evidence in, for example, India in the 19th century for wearing shields on the back, where they equally they confer some degree of protection to you. Hanging and dangling from the side of your horse's saddle is not a useful place to stick a shield. Instead of, if you're not going to use the shield, why have it there at all? Why not just completely abandon it and annoy your horse a bit less and probably help it run a bit faster? So there we go. The fact that the Riders of Rohan have perfectly serviceable and historically accurate and valid design of shields, and they don't use them when they're on horseback. They just have them dangling there. Of course, we know the real reason is probably because the horse riders weren't very confident at holding a shield and controlling their horses at the same time. But nevertheless, I find it annoying. I would have preferred that they just left the shields off altogether. And at number 1, is it going to be one of Gimli's axes? No, I don't have a huge problem with them, actually. I think they're quite good for dwarf axes. Number 1 is something which I suspect a lot of people won't have even noticed. Elf arrowheads. That's right. I am super bothered by elf arrowheads. As someone who has done archery since I was 11 years old, I am, considering and being a fan of elves as well, as a player of role-playing games and all this kind of stuff when I was younger. I think that elves, who are a culture of archery and of bows and archery equipment, and as someone who understands how arrows work, the fact that these arrows are designed to impede penetration really bothers me. Now, That's not to say that arrowheads like this have never existed in our world historically. In fact, they have existed for very specific purposes, such as hunting, where you don't want to, when you want to kill a small animal like a rabbit or something, and you don't want to lose the arrow, or perhaps for target purposes. But this type of arrowhead used as a weapon of war makes absolutely no sense, because it will penetrate maybe an inch or two into your body and then stop. And in stopping, it will snap the shaft off and it will not gravely wound the person. It will be fairly unpleasant. But in addition to that, if it hits any kind of armour, it's going to have an enormous problem penetrating that, whether it's mail, even leather perhaps, and certainly any type of plate armour. So there we go. Elf arrowheads are what my #1 bugbear of all the weapons in the original Lord of the Rings trilogy. I'm not talking about the sequels because there are a lot of weapon crimes in those movies. But elf arrowheads for me take #1 annoying weapon of LOTR original trilogy. Feel free to share what you think are the most annoying or silly weapons in the original trilogy. I will be dealing with armour in a separate video, and there is a lot to say about the armour in the original Lord of the Rings trilogy, but feel free to share your views below on weapons or armour that you find annoying or good, in fact, in the original Lord of the Rings trilogy. And I just want to finish off by saying that, generally speaking, I love the Lord of the Rings movies. I think they're great. I think they stood up to the test of time really well. I think they're modern classics, and I do think, by and large, the arms and equipment shown in those movies is good, is convincing, and I do like it for the most part. Thanks for watching my video. Please give me a like, assuming you liked the video, and if you haven't subscribed, please think about doing so. Share this video, and I'll see you really soon for another video on Scholar Gladiatoria channel. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks!